Reverie and Interpretation, Thomas H. Ogden, Chap 3. The Perverse Subject of Analysis. Part 2. Discussion. Ms. A.'s very first statement to me was about her marriage unconsciously, her life being a sham. It took a long time for me to understand in any depth what it was that she was unconsciously attempting to tell me. From the outset, there was a subliminal seductive coyness to Ms. A.'s presentation of herself. There was also a quality of mystery conveyed by all that was not being said, which contributed to my feeling of being in the dark, perhaps unconsciously in a darkened bedroom. In retrospect, my initial thoughts about the patient and me as characters in detective film can be understood as a reflection of my then unconscious sense that the analytic relationship was being constructed on a foundation involving a confusing mixture of grandiose erotized fantasy, prevarication, self-deception, and the background theme of a perverse primal scene. The sadomasochistic incestuous relationship depicted in Chinatown. I had found the patient's accounts of her childhood, her stories, to be not only interesting but often fascinating. There was a way in which the patient continued to be captivated and captivating by her experience of having occupied a privileged position in which she could pose as a child while not feeling like a child in a secret world of adult sexual excitement and exhibitionism. She observed and participated in, from a distance, the parties that were unconsciously equated with the primal scene. The patient felt that no ordinary child would be allowed to have knowledge of, much less see, hear, smell, or touch these extraordinary events. Ms. A. imagined that she knew important and frightening secrets. For example, the secret of her father's financial, sexual, emotional bankruptcy, and the secret that some people had succeeded in remaining both male and female, as represented by the homosexuality and cross-dressing that she observed and vividly remembered. Less conscious of the patient in her initial account of her childhood was a central role of the illusion of her not being only a child, and instead being a part of an adult intercourse in which she, in identification with the homosexual and transvestite figures, was not limited to being a member of a single sex nor fixed in a single generation. See Shaskett, Smergel, 1984. As exciting as Ms. A. found the adult discourse/intercourse which she observed and which she, in fantasy, participated, the intercourse was at the same time experienced as dead. The patient unconsciously knew of her parents' separate sleeping arrangements and sensed the emptiness of the partially drug-induced, hypomanic, exhibitionistic sexual scene which she found to be frightening, repulsive, otherworldly, and yet repetitive and tedious. This paradoxical flatness of the exciting experience represented a powerful element of the transference-countertransference. Both the patient and I attempted to disguise and enliven the persistent absence of spontaneous thought in the analysis with unconsciously erotized cleverness. For example, the pressure to which both the patient and I were responding in our name dropping, and in the effort to use just the right, knowing phrase. My reverie about the opening of the car wash in the parking lot provided an important medium through which to experience elements of the transference-countertransference that had been present from early on, but had been very little available to either Ms. A. or to me for generating verbally symbolized analytic meaning. My reverie involved the fantasy of a loud vacuum cleaner being operated by a diabolical couple from whom I was helplessly cut off. The couple seemed to operate in a realm that was above the law and beyond the reach of words and human emotion. In the reverie, not only was there no law at City Hall, there was no human presence at its core. This reverie represented an important development in the evolution of the analytic process in that it allowed me something of a foothold in perspective that was both outside of and yet informed by the intersubjective construction in which I was participating, the perverse subject of analysis. The meaning of the car wash reverie felt quite disconnected from my experience in the transference-countertransference, and yet the reverie had a profoundly disturbing effect on me and let me be alert in a qualitatively different way to what I was experiencing with this patient. I began to notice, with a considerable degree of shame, both the pride that I was feeling in being Ms. A.'s analyst, the pleasure in being seen with her, and the pleasure I was taking in observing her clothes that were being laid at my feet. At the same time, I became aware of the feeling of a hole or blind spot in my awareness that made me feel all the more that I was blinding himself to something important in my role as analyst for Ms. A. See Steiner, 1985, for a discussion of the meanings of turning a blind eye in the Oedipus myth. The accretion of experiences that I described led to rather diffuse anxiety that I've been experiencing to be transformed into a much more clearly defined and consciously articulated sexual anxiety associated with seeing and being seen. I experienced this anxiety in the form of the unsettling conscious fantasy that each time I encountered Ms. A. in the waiting room, I was meeting her for a date. The patient's telling me her dream of the observed man served to crystallize several powerful unconscious constellations of meaning that had structured the experience of the transference-countertransference to that point. Despite my feeling of sudden recognition, my awareness of the pivotal importance of the experience of secretly observing and being observed had been developing over a rather long period of time, as reflected in my reveries. When the patient told me her dream, a marked affective shift occurred. What I had previously experienced as ideas about erotized observing and being observed now became a detailed, visceral knowledge of the experience of being caught in the act of a particular form of curious, sexualized looking. The nature of the exposure involved in the transference-countertransference event was the exposure of the infant/child excitedly observing, and in fantasy participating in, the primal scene. My feelings of shame associated with this act derived in large part from the feeling of being revealed to be a presumptuous and self-deceptive infant/child pretending to be an adult participant in the primal scene. The transference-countertransference experience being discussed was not simply an experience of being painfully exposed. It was equally an unconscious experience of excitedly tempting the observer and then exposing the observer to be the excluded infant/child that he or she is. Fundamental to the patient's experience of catching the observer in the act was her defensive disavowal, splitting off in projection her feelings of being the envious, excluded, curious, sexually aroused, self-deceptive infant. Moreover, Ms. E.S. act of tempting me in a way described was a source of excitement in itself, and that there was the ever-present danger of her being caught in the act of secretly observing me observing her. It must be remembered that all of this was occurring in the context of what was otherwise a dead discourse/intercourse, non-self-reflective reporting and storytelling that was almost entirely devoid of spontaneous, creative thought. In this light, the excitement of the exciting/dangerous game being described represented an unconscious effort to create a substitute for a genuinely creative discourse/intercourse. The patient's dream imagery underscored the deadness of the intercourse. The depressed old man in the dark room was only going through the motions of reading and was unsuccessfully attempting to use sexual excitement to distract himself from his emptiness and depression. The excitement/danger in the dream, partially experienced as a sensation of being on the verge of involuntary urination, lay in the act of secretly observing the man, his symbolic intercourse, and in secretly being observed in the act of observing. The interpretations that I offered at this point were informed by my experiences in and of the perverse transference-countertransference, which experiences allowed me to understand and feel compassion for both the exposed and the exposing aspects of the internal object relationship that so dominated the patient's life and the life of the analysis. The patient then became engaged in the process of retelling a life, Schaeffer 1994, not in the sense of telling again, but in the sense of recasting the past in the context of a new set of intersubjective experiences that had occurred in the transference-countertransference and were in the process of occurring in the analysis. A new narrative was generated by the patient that held a form of coherence of past and present that was rooted in a less fearful, less anxiously self-deceptive experience of herself and her relations with others. In this period of work, Ms. A evidenced a capacity for reflective thought. Words were no longer primarily a medium for creating a siren song, and instead were used as a vehicle for participating in an analytic discourse shaped by the recognition of roles of analyst and analysand. In addition, the patient evidenced for the first time the beginnings of capacity to contain live with her fear of deadness, as represented in her dream of being paralyzed and without sensation in her legs, that she had so strenuously attempted to mask through the use of defensive sexualization. Silence could now be tolerated rather than being immediately transformed into the noise of the erotized, magnetic storytelling. At the same time, it must be emphasized that the analytic movement being described reflects only the beginnings of what would eventually become a more stable set of psychological changes. The defensive pseudo-maturity involved in the perverse excitement of the initial stages of analysis were followed by other forms of defense against the feeling of humiliation of being only an infant in a confusing/frightening/exciting/dead adult world. For example, in the course of Ms. A's telling me about the ways in which she felt possessed in adolescence and as a young adult, the transference as total situation, Klein 1952, Joseph 1985, Ogden 1991a, involved a sense of anxiously pressured collegiality in which there was an effort to deny generational and role differences in the analytic relationship. Moreover, intellectualization was used to protect the patient from feelings of not knowing, of being in the dark. Although the transference anxieties being warded off were similar in nature to those experienced in the earlier stages of work, the perversion of the transference-countertransference no longer constituted the principal medium of communication, defense, and object relatedness. Before leaving the clinical portion of the chapter, J would like to briefly elaborate an idea that has been implicit in the foregoing discussion. An element of technique that is reflected in the analysis that has been described is the analyst's use of his mundane, unobtrusive, quotidian thoughts, feelings, sensations, fantasies, daydreams, ruminations, and so on in the process of attempting to understand a network of intersubjectively generated meanings constituting the transference-countertransference. The experience of understanding that evolved in the portion of the analysis just described had the quality of a disturbing recognition, a sense of sudden reversal. This quality of psychological movement, i.e., an unsettling recognition of a formerly split-off unconscious discourse, reflected the nature of the perverse process and its precarious, potentially explosive tension between honesty and deception, intimacy and manipulation, the authentic and the counterfeit. It is important to bear in mind that the use of reverie in the understanding of the transference-countertransference is usually a much quieter process and does not often lead to such dramatic shifts in perspective or feelings of shameful self-deception. Some theoretical comments. Building upon the understanding of aspects of the perverse transference-countertransference discussed above, as well as my experience in analyzing similar transference-countertransference enactments in work with other patients, Ogden 1994b, I shall offer some tentative thoughts about what I believe to be important elements of the structure of this form of perversion. The perverse individual of the type being discussed experiences a sense of inner deadness, a lack of a sense of being alive as a human being, Kahn 1979, McDougall 1978, 1986. At the same time, there develops a set of concretely symbolized offensive fantasies that life exists in intercourse, both sexual and non-sexual, between the parents, and that the only way to acquire life is to enter into that intercourse, the source of life, from which the individual is excluded and left lifeless. Britain 1989, Klein 1926, 1928, Meltzer 1973, O'Shaughnessy 1989. Of course, in a literal way, it is a parental intercourse that is the source of the patient's life. But this biological fact has, for the perverse patient, failed to become a psychological fact. At the same time, these perverse patients fantasize/experience the parental intercourse, in the broadest sense of the word, to be an empty event, and imagine that the lifelessness of the primal scene is the source of his or her own sense of inner deadness. In part, this fantasy is based on the patient's own envious attack on the parental intercourse. It also reflects the patient's experience, a combination of perception and fantasy, of the emptiness of the bond between the parents. This perception/fantasy of an absence at the core of human discourse/intercourse leaves these perverse individuals feeling that there is no hope of attaining a sense of vitality of their own internal world and in their relations with external objects. What is particular to perversion of the sort being discussed is the compulsive eroticization of the void that is felt the center of what might have been and pretends to be a generative union between the parents. The excitement generated by this eroticization is used as a substitute for a sense of one's own human aliveness, as well as a recognition of the humanness of other people. This erotic substitution is unconsciously experienced as a lie, and other people are compulsively enlisted in the enactment of the sexualized lie. The unconsciously fantasied empty parental intercourse is defensively rendered exciting in part by attributing to it the feeling of danger. These perverse patients repeatedly and compulsively enlist others in the process of enacting the fantasy of entering into the parental intercourse, which enactments are felt to involve a threat to the patient's life, McDougall 1986. There is at the same time a critical act of self-deception that allows the patient to isolate himself from awareness of the reality of the danger to which he is subjecting himself. The individual deludes himself and prides himself in his belief that he is able to fly closer to flame than anybody else without being damaged. He or she believes him or herself to be immune to all danger, while at the same time being intensely excited by it. The desperate need to extract life from and infuse life into the empty parental intercourse leads the patient to flaunt external reality and unconsciously claim to exist outside of the law, including both the laws of society and the laws of nature. Schaskett-Smergel 1984. Since the individual psychological life has in a sense already been lost, or more accurately, has never come into being, there is a certain reality to the idea that he has nothing to lose. The foregoing comments might be briefly stated in the form of the following set of schematic propositions. 1. In healthy development, a sense of oneself as alive is equated with a generative, loving parental intercourse. Out of this intercourse comes a feeling of aliveness from which the patient derives a sense of vitality and realness of his or her own thoughts, feelings, sensations, subjectivity, object relations, and so on. 2. Perversion of the type being discussed represents an endless, futile effort to extract life from a primal scene that is experienced as dead. 3. Perversions of this sort involves a form of excitement derived from the cynical subversion of the purported truth of the aliveness of the parental intercourse, which source of vitality is felt to be inaccessible and probably non-existent. In other words, the seemingly generative, loving parental intercourse is felt to be a lie, a hoax. These perverse individuals interject a fantasy-degraded intercourse and subsequently engage others in a compulsively repeated acting out of this set of internal object relationships. For, in this form of perversion, a vicious cycle is generated in which the fantasied intercourse of the parents is depicted as loveless, lifeless, and non-procreative. The patient attempts in vain to infuse it with pseudo-excitement from which he attempts to extract life, or more accurately, attempts to create a substitute for life. Since the fantasied parental intercourse from which the perverse patient is attempting to extract life is experienced as dead, he or she is attempting to extract life from death, truth from falsehood. Alternatively, the patient may attempt to use a lie as a substitute for truth/life, Schaskett-Smergel 1984. 5. An important method of attempting to infuse the empty primal scene with life, excitement, and other substitutes for feelings of aliveness is the experience of flirting with danger, tempting fate by flying too close to the flame. 6. The desire of these perverse individuals is co-opted by and confused with the desire of others, leading them more deeply into defensive misrecognitions and misnaming of their experience in order to create the illusion of self-generated desire, Ogden 1988a. 7. Analysis of perversion, as clinically illustrated in this chapter, fundamentally involves recognizing, naming accurately, the lie/lifelessness that constitutes the core of the transference enactment of the perversion. In this way, the patient, perhaps for the first time in his or her life, feels engaged in a discourse that is experienced as alive and real. 8. The initial feelings of aliveness and realness in the analysis arise from the recognition of the lifelessness/lie of the transference-countertransference, and consequently, are most often frightening feelings of deadness. This experience is different from the deadness of the lie/lifelessness that had not been recognized as a lie, and which had been masquerading as truth. Formerly, the lie, the empty intercourse, had to be infused with false/perverse excitement in an effort to bring life to it and acquire life from it. The recognition of the lie is not an experience of sexual excitement, but makes possible a state of mind in which sexual aliveness, in the context of whole object relations, and generative thinking and discourse might be experienced. Concluding comments. In this chapter, I have clinically illustrated the way in which the analysis of perversion necessarily involves the elaboration of an unconscious perverse transference-countertransference, which is contributed to and participated in by both analyst and analysand. This intersubjective construction is powerfully shaped by the perverse structure of the patient's unconscious internal object world. The analyst's understanding of the perverse enactment in which he or she is an unwitting participant is developed in part to the collaboration and analysis of unobtrusive quotidian thoughts. Feelings, fantasies, daydreams, ruminations, sensations, and which are often seemingly unrelated to the patient. Understandings developed in this way are utilized in the process of the formulation of transference interpretations.